Well, good morning, St. Peter's. I hope that we might be in person, but this video is in case we're not able to. And I do really ask God's blessing upon you if you're suffering with anxiety around COVID-19. Well, have you been in a conversation where it's been going fine, and then someone suddenly drops a bomb? A statement like a bomb, like a landmine. A statement like, oh, I just get sick of the Treaty of Waitangi. Or, you know, those 5G towers give you coronavirus. Don't think so. Or vaccinations cause autism. A statement that suddenly makes your eyes glaze over and you think, oh, I'm not going any further with this conversation. I recently watched The Morning Show. It's a show on Apple TV. Brilliant piece of TV about the Me Too movement. In the show, the fictional character Bradley Jackson gets flustered in the start of her first appearance on nationwide TV and lists off a few things she does as a teenager, including the phrase, heck, when I was 15 I had an abortion. And it suddenly goes silent and you can see the fire alarms in everyone's eyes over the controversy that she's just started. When we enter into spiritual conversations, it's like entering a minefield. My aim today is to help you avoid setting off a mine and responding gently if someone else sets off a mine for you. Dave Mann, who we're indebted to for the outline of these sermons, talks about sour notes. You know, when you're listening to a group of singers and you can tell that just someone's a little bit off. That's a sour note. The same thing happens in conversations. People say things that sound wrong to us. Sometimes Christians say things that might be a sour note to others, and often people in the general population say things that might be a sour note to us. Today we're going to look at trying to turn those into opportunities rather than the conversation killers. Well, 2 weeks ago, Keith opened our series by talking about a conversational approach to sharing faith, and started with the idea that a great conversation starts with a great question. Right at the start, the question might be, are you a spiritual person? As a way into a faith conversation. Last week, Kate introduced us to Frank Ritchie and his interest in those who followed him on Twitter. What do they believe? And we remember that many people in New Zealand do have a spiritual interest, but are very cautious of organised religion. So how can we engage in non-threatening, genuine, two-way spiritual conversations? That's the goal of this series. Well, today we're going to look at when we disagree, how we can affirm the things that we do agree with, and then gently ask more about the things that we probably disagree with. In some ways, they're basic conversation skills, but conversation skills that sometimes freeze up when we start talking about spiritual matters. Here's 3 great questions. What do you mean by that? Where did you get that idea from? Have you considered? Maybe this week you'll meet someone that says something like, I just think it's so important that we pass the euthanasia bill at the referendum. And instead of jumping straight in with what you think, maybe you could say, yeah, I'm really concerned about people suffering at the end of their life. But what do you think that about the euthanasia bill? Open it up a bit, rather than close it down. So today I'm talking about converse, don't confront. How to keep the conversation going rather than shutting it down. Now, we all come from a family of origin, and in some of our families, if someone says something that they think is a load of rubbish, we go, oh, it's a load of rubbish. It's probably more like my family. And some families, if you say something that's controversial, they'll go, oh, and then ignore it. And then in some families, they'll go, really? Tell me more, why do you think that? And show genuine interest. That third approach of trying to understand a bit better, even if behind the scenes you go, well, I don't agree with that, is what we want to cultivate. Let's look at an account of Jesus talking with someone who could have been very threatened by him, but wasn't. So John 8, 1 to 11. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again in the temple. A crowd soon gathered and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman has been caught in adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Well, let's look at the context. The temple guards had already been sent by the Pharisees to try to arrest Jesus because they considered his claims were blasphemous. But the guards had not arrested him because they were awed by all that Jesus did and said. So, even being in the temple that morning was challenging. It was remarkably bold of Jesus. Things were getting tense. Now, the immediate situation is they were trying to trap Jesus. Theologically, the law of Moses did set down stoning for both parties who were caught in adultery, because adultery destroys social fabric. But the cultural context was that the Romans had banned the Jews from using the death penalty. So if Jesus even wanted to say, well, I agree with Moses, he'd get in trouble with the Romans. So what could Jesus do? Well, first of all, he didn't do anything. He was just quiet. If he was lax with the law, he'd be condemned by the Jews. If he applied the law, he'd be condemned by the Romans. It's a bit like Catch-22. The story goes on. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dirt. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, then neither do I. Go and sin no more. Well, let's consider how Jesus responded. Firstly, well, we don't have to answer every question. Jesus' first response was just to avoid, and that's not always the wrong response. What was he writing on the ground? Maybe it was something relevant. Maybe he was just taking his time to collect his thoughts. Maybe he knew the danger of speaking too quickly. Secondly, Jesus often replied to a question with a question to return the onus of proof to the inquirer. In this case, he did something similar. He asked them a kind of question. Those of you who want to condemn you, throw the stone first. And thirdly, he wrote in the sand again. We don't know what he wrote. Maybe he wrote a list of other sins. Maybe there were things that the religious leaders recognized. Notice that Jesus didn't actually disagree with the statement that the woman deserved the death penalty. Technically, the woman and her partner, under the law of Moses at the time, were destroying social fabric and were subject to the death penalty. However, there's lots of things to note here. Firstly, Jesus was the only one who had the right to stand there when everyone else had left because he was sinless. Secondly, the wider teaching of Jesus in the New Testament affirmed the law, but changes who pays the penalty. Jesus paid the death penalty so that we can be set free. And of course, there's the wider issue of justice. Where was the man who was committing adultery? This woman wasn't brought to Jesus because they wanted justice. This was a trap. And finally, Jesus said he didn't condemn her, and then gave her a second with the charts with the instruction, go and sin no more. Because Jesus was on his way to Calvary to pay for his sin. In fact, to pay for all our sins so that we can be forgiven and also set free. I wonder, do you think the woman felt condemned by Jesus? He's theoretically the one who could condemn her. I don't think she felt threatened by him. He didn't excuse her sin, but he believed in her. One of the most remarkable characteristics of Jesus was the fact that ordinary, messy people didn't feel threatened by him. They invited him to meals, they ate with him and didn't feel threatened. In contrast, Jesus was threatening to the proud, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. He was invited by them to meals also. But at those meals he was scrutinized and he was judged. They were looking for a way to condemn and criticize him. So back to our topic. Conversation, not confrontation. How do we avoid those clangers, those sour notes? How do we be non-threatening? I want to suggest there's a key way to do that. It's really important for us as Christians to be able to deal with people who have quite different views for us. Because we want to be able to talk to our neighbours in open conversations without awkwardness, and especially without them feeling preached at. This is something I'd love to do more. I'd really love to have more open spiritual conversations without being judgy, without feeling like people are feeling judged. So how do we do that? Well, I really like Dave Mann's approach. He says the key is to drop the agenda of trying to convert people. Now, we may end up talking about spiritual things and actually presenting what we believe, but the start is we're not out to notch up something on our belt. We just actually want to have an interesting conversation about matters of faith, listening and then responding. He also gives us this lovely verse out of Luke. Out of the outflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, the key to creating the feel of conversation is motive. If our motive is to share, to talk about faith without imposing, without judging, then the conversations will open up. Let me illustrate. We all know salespeople. I was down at Robert Harris last week, and there was a guy trying to sell his book at the door. I avoided him on the way in, and then he got me on the way out. He didn't ask me, he just talked at me. You know, he had an agenda. He wanted to sell me his book, but he played it entirely the wrong way. Now, a number of years ago, I used to work for the Alpha course. Essentially, I was a salesman, but I loved doing that because I loved Alpha, and I knew it was a great resource. And I didn't need to push people. I'd tell them about Alpha, I'd encourage them, but when they showed back off, I'd back off as well. Because I knew that many of them would come back to us later. Because they'd hear about it from someone else, they'd have the situation of, I want to teach about faith. And Alpha is such a good resource, it sells itself. And so I had this great experience of being a salesman without needing to be pushy. Because I know that when you start pressuring, you start failing. And this is the key dynamic for all our spiritual conversations. Listen to our mate's story. We might learn something about spirituality. Huh? Jesus is the truth, but there is a wide range of other wider truth as well that actually later we can connect into Jesus. We don't want to react. We don't want to judge. We might look at where God might be at work in someone's story. We don't have to say that. And we might offer to pray for someone if something comes up. As we said in week 1, we don't need to jump in with Jesus as the answer too soon. But secondly, having listened and being involved, we can be a bit like a brand ambassador for Jesus and say, you know, Jesus is important to me. I've found some answers here at the right time. If our agenda is not to preach at, not to tell, not to change, but to listen and just talk, then opportunities will come up. Out of the outflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Motive feeds conversation rather than confrontation. If we come to spiritual conversations wanting to meet, understand, discuss, then people won't be threatened by us. 3 final ideas. 1, respect their free will. Our motive is not to coerce or convert someone. Ultimately, they're the ones who decide whether to follow Jesus. God converts, not us. Second of all, if we want to share something, if we think we're getting to a point of wanting to share something that's not naturally come up in the conversation, then just ask permission. Can I talk about it? I love the story I heard about a friend who'd never got the chance, and they said, look, can I take you out to lunch and talk about my faith? And his friend said, yeah, sure. Okay? And if he'd said no, it would have been fine as well. And then thirdly, to respect, everyone is on a spiritual journey, whether they'd identify it or not. And so we're not trying to impose. The motive is just draw out, see, listen, discover, see if there is a touch point. If there's not, then to wait. Affirm what we agree with in spiritual conversation. Bound to be something we can agree with. And then ask about what we disagree with rather than launch into, oh no. Now we've got a couple of series coming up, or a couple of things coming up in the community about euthanasia, about abortion, about many of the issues, marijuana, that will give us some resources. But we need to be careful how we use those resources. In other words, we come with the aim of discovering what we can agree together with to build on our connection, encouraging, sharing hope, conversation, rather than to say, what's wrong, and you need to be corrected, and confrontation. Because confrontation won't lead us where we want to go. yes, sometimes there's a point for it, but not until we've got well into a friendship. It's okay to go deeper in the conversation, but so often we don't get the chance because we don't get off first base, because we put our foot wrong. We close down the conversation. Once we've been talking for half an hour, of course we can put other things in there. And we can say, well, on that point, I disagree with you. But let's not start the conversation with that. Let's not set off a landmine in our first sentence. My friends, I want to ask God's blessing upon you as you try to converse rather than confront. That when you hear those sort of sour notes or landmines, let's try to just unpack it a bit more rather than starting with, oh no, I disagree with that. We don't need to say, I disagree, if we want to continue the conversation. God bless. Let's pray. Loving God, I pray that you might help our people to enter into really interesting spiritual conversations with our friends and neighbours. Not judging, not jumping in with the confrontation, but opening up the conversation and seeing what you might do.